In the land before Abraham, when the winds still carried memories of the great flood, a new hope spread over the green hills and fertile valleys that now flourished under the blessing of the Most High God. This was the world of Shem, son of Noah. The waters that had destroyed everything were low, and where once there was silence and emptiness, now echoed the renewed voices of those who were emerging to restart humanity. Shem was someone special in that time of new beginnings. Even among his brothers, Japheth and Ham, there was something different about him. His eyes saw beyond the horizon. There was a rare serenity in his gestures and words, as if he carried with him a deep understanding of all that God had done. He grew up listening to the stories his father, Noah, told at night by the tent, stories about the ark, about trust in God's promise, about survival when all seemed lost. These stories were not just the past for Shem, they were foundations, living lessons, seeds that would sprout in a life marked by faith. The new people, children and grandchildren scattered across the earth, looked to Shem for wisdom. He made a point of caring for his family, advising his sons Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram, and also reaching out to his brothers, even when life demanded forgiveness and reconciliation. After the flood, every laugh, every shared meal had a special flavor, because everyone knew how fragile and precious existence was. One day, while walking through the fields, Shem saw an argument between his brothers. Sharp words flew through the air, arguments about possessions, because now there was a lot of land, but also a lot of insecurity. Shem approached slowly, his presence calm, and waited for silence. He reminded his brothers of the promise God had made to their grandfather Lamech and their father Noah, that through them, the whole earth would be inhabited, and that God's blessing was not in possessions, but in obedience to the Lord and respect for one another. Shem knew of Ham's mistake in dishonoring Noah, his father. Shem knew how to choose a different stance. Together with Japheth, he covered himself and respected his father's dignity while he slept vulnerable. He did not hesitate to show honor to the one who, through obedience and faith, saved the family and gave a new chance to all of humanity. Shem's heart became known for its integrity, a rare virtue in the newly reborn world. Time passed, and Shem became the patriarch of many generations. The blessing Noah had bestowed upon him became visible. From his descendants would come peoples and kings, and one day, long after, a man named Abraham would be called a friend of God. But at that time, Shem was only a bridge between the past of the flood and the bright future of God's promises. Shem never forgot that the secret of life was to honor God with all that he was and had. His story teaches us that even in a world of new beginnings and difficulties, faithfulness, respect for family, and surrender to God's will prepare paths of blessing for those who come after us. As night fell, Shem looked up at the stars and knew that even in the midst of uncertainty, the Lord would fulfill every promise. He couldn't imagine it, but from his lineage, a great nation would be born. And that was just the beginning. Soon, unexpected paths would cross the destinies of Shem and his children, carrying forward the story that would change the world forever. On damp, quiet mornings, Shem gathered his children around the fire to share not only memories, but also the teachings that stirred in his heart. He knew that as the family grew, so did the challenges of living in harmony and keeping alive the faith of the early days. Villages were now forming, people were moving away, and cultures were emerging from the descendants who were multiplying and seeking their place in the world. Shem, more than anyone else, felt the weight of the responsibility to keep the covenant with God alive. One night, after the wind whistled through the tents, Shem noticed that his son Arpachshad was restless. The boy, who had a questioning spirit, looked into the distance as if searching for something beyond the hills. Shem approached him calmly, listening to his son's lament about his fear of the future and the temptation to abandon the ways taught by his grandfather Noah. The world was changing rapidly, other peoples were emerging, and it was easy to get lost in pride or the pursuit of riches. Shem, with a gentle voice and a steady gaze, shared with Arpachshad what he had learned since he was a boy, that true greatness is not found in external achievements, but in humility before God and justice in dealing with others. He told him about the danger of Ham's deviation and how, because of a small act of dishonor, profound consequences fell upon generations. He He reminded his son that it is up to each person to choose, every day, to be faithful and keep their hearts sensitive to the voice of the Creator. Listening to his father, Arphaxad felt the weight of eternity rest on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a valuable inheritance. Shem's eyes shone with hope, for he knew that planting values in the hearts of his children was his greatest legacy. The sun rose strong behind the mountains, and a new journey awaited Shem and all his descendants. However, the world around them was changing rapidly, threatening the unity of the family with new ideas and challenges, and soon it would be up to them to choose between remaining faithful or losing themselves in the unknown. Shem realized that the tranquility of the early years after the flood was beginning to be threatened by murmurs and divisions among his own descendants. The gatherings around the fire, once filled with laughter and stories, were now marked by veiled arguments. Young people debated traditions and new customs brought by travelers from distant lands. Noah's words, remembered with reverence by Shem, sounded to the younger ones like echoes of a distant past. The patriarch watched in worried silence as his instructions were often challenged or reinterpreted. Among some of his grandchildren, there was a certain desire for autonomy, to seek their own glory, to experience the unknown, believing that they could build a more prosperous life far from the roots of their faith. One night, Shem noticed that his son Arphaxad was missing. The patriarch's heart sank, for he knew that the boy had joined a group of young people inclined to defy the teachings inherited from Noah. Shem set out in search of his son, guided by the light of the stars, crossing trails that led beyond the limits of the camp. He found Arphaxad sitting by a stream, deep in thought, his gaze lost in the movement of the water. Shem sat down beside him in silence. Only after some time did the words come, laden with confession and doubt. Arphaxad revealed that he had considered leaving his family to explore emerging cities, where other young people were trying to build grand towers, seeking to make their names eternal. Shem felt fear grow in his chest. He knew that this desire for glory was similar to the root of pride that had destroyed so many before them. With serenity, he pulled a handful of earth, showing his son how, despite its insignificance, each grain had its role in the fertile soil. He sowed in Arphaxad's heart the understanding that the greatest achievements are those that remain before God, not before men. The hidden intentions of growing through vanity needed to be replaced by humble trust and divine promises. The absence of light in distant cities was not only a lack of torches, but an absence of true purpose. The conversation ended with a knowing silence. Shem knew that a decisive moment was near. Soon he and his sons would have to choose between following the gentle voice of the one who created everything or being seduced by the tempting noise of fame and power. The decisions made now would determine the blessing of future generations. As they returned home together, Arphaxad seemed different, and Shem felt that, at least in that heart, the seed of faith was being reborn under the watchful eye of the Eternal One. Time passed, stripping away the silent innocence of the early days after the flood. With each new dawn, Shem felt the signs of age marking his steps, but at the same time, he noticed a new weight on his soul, anxiety about the future of his descendants. Even after their conversation by the stream, he saw in the eyes of the young people a mixture of admiration, doubt, and seductive promises of a world that longed to break the old boundaries. One afternoon, clouds gathered on the horizon, foreshadowing the storm that was forming not only in the sky but also among the villages. Rumors spread that part of the people, led by a distant relative of Cam, had planned to abandon the plain where the family had settled. They intended to join those who, near the Great Valley, were building a tower as high as their own pride, defying the warnings of the elders and the humility taught by Shem. The unrest turned into cries among the younger ones, and some began to pack their belongings, stirred by the fascination of a life beyond the limits of their known world. Shem, attentive to every glance, gathered his children and grandchildren in a circle in the flickering light of the torches. His calloused hands held the staff, and his voice, firm despite his age, cut through the silence. He shared his fear, not of losing his children to the world, but of seeing them give in to the emptiness of pride and separation. He reminded them of the covenant renewed with each generation, that true greatness only flourishes where there is humility, service, and love for the Creator. Some eyes filled with tears, others turned away. The wind whistled outside, carrying with it fragments of childhood and dreams. That night, Shem did not sleep. The wind brought him whispered prayers to the Creator, painful words from someone who feels his children slipping through his fingers like water. In the silence, he sought strength to accept maturity. He realized that protecting his children's faith was less about restraint and more about trust, less about control and more about surrender. He felt not fear growing inside him, but a silent hope. The seeds he had sown, though invisible now, had in God's promises the guarantee that one day they would sprout, firm, resisting the vanity of human towers and oblivion. The sky began to brighten, and Shem rose, knowing that each dawn would demand of him, more than ever, courage, renewed faith, and the patient love of a true patriarch. The dawn crackled silently when Shem was awakened by a distant clamor, voices broken by the wind and the stirring of shadows. The young men who had left in search of the promises of the cities had hurriedly returned to the camp. Their faces were downcast, and their eyes, once shining with expectation, now reflected fear and uncertainty. They trembled, covered in dust and sweat, carrying on their shoulders not only the dust of the journey, but also the weight of something indescribable. Shem rose slowly and walked toward them. One of them, his son Arphaxad, was the first to speak, but his voice was almost a whisper. He told them about the new city where men from all over were seeking to rise above the heavens, joining forces to build a tower that, they said, would serve as a symbol of unity and power. However, as the walls rose, the hearts of the men were filled with confusion, and the words they had once understood became noise, as if an invisible veil had descended upon them all. At the height of their distress, some began to fight, others to isolate themselves. Hidden intentions emerged. It was not pure unity, but dispute, mistrust, and pride multiplying. Arphaxad confessed that, in the darkest moment, he felt overcome by a gentle presence, an unexpected warmth in his chest, which commanded him to return, listen to the voice of his ancestors, and seek the guidance of the Most High. Around him, other young people admitted to hearing whispers of repentance and a reverent fear that silenced the vanity in their own hearts. As he listened to each account, Shem felt his eyes fill with tears. For the first time in a long time, it was not just the weight of leadership that he carried on his shoulders, but a deep relief to see that the seeds planted in the silence of faith were sprouting, even in inhospitable soil. He embraced Arphaxad and all the others, blessing them with ancient words of trust and hope. At that moment, a different wind blew through the camp, bringing with it remnants of the night's rain and the scent of wet earth, a sign of renewed promise. It was as if the Creator himself had breathed a new spirit upon them all, not one of fear, but of humble hope. Each one, touched by the miracle of inner transformation, felt part of something greater, bound not by the pursuit of glory, but by the invisible bond of rediscovered faith. Shem raised his arms to the sky, silently giving thanks for the miracle that was taking place within each heart, certain that the legacy of the true patriarch is one that flourishes through justice and love. The sun rose slowly behind the hills, gilding the tents of the camp. The wind that had blown during the night seemed to have cleared away the anxieties, but in Shem's heart now weighed an even deeper responsibility. The young people's accounts echoed like answered prayers, and as he walked among the belongings and faces of his family, Shem perceived the presence of the divine as a veil of light over everyone. The people were more united, touched by the recent miracle, but the memory of those who had left and the dangers of pride still hung over everyone. That morning, Shem felt a different urgency. He knew that the covenant of the ancients, made with tears and sacrifices when they left the ark, needed to be reaffirmed for the new times. While the people gathered around, Shem climbed the nearest hill, carrying only his staff and his heart open before the Creator. From above, he saw the plains stretching to the horizon, rivers winding through the fertile lands, villages scattered like seeds. The silence was profound, but within Shem, the voices of his family vibrated like a chorus of hope. He knelt down and, with his hands turned toward the sky, cried out to the Most High not only for the protection of his children, but for the renewal of the faith of all his descendants. He wept for each one who had lost their way and for those who might still stray. As he prayed, a soft light pierced the clouds and descended upon the mountain. The air seemed to vibrate, and Shem felt enveloped by an overwhelming peace, as if God himself were embracing him. Words of blessing flowed from his mouth as if whispered by the Creator, renewing the covenant, blessing each child, grandchild, and all who were yet to come. The people watching from the camp were overcome by the same feeling. Some fell to their knees, others raised their hands to the heavens. There was a harmony and fervor that swept through old and young alike, overflowing in tears of gratitude. There, before everyone, Shem descended from the mountain and, overcome by the power of faith, announced that the family should never forget what they had witnessed. God was present. True power was not that of towers, but of surrendered hearts and families united by a promise. On that day, the decision was sealed in every soul. The promise of the Most High would be kept, and as long as they remained humble and faithful, no barrier or pride would separate them from the Creator. The days passed after the renewal of the covenant, and a deep quiet settled over the camp. But in Shem's heart, the serenity was accompanied by a growing sense of awareness. With each new dawn, he saw not only the harmony restored among his children and grandchildren, but he also understood clearly that everything they had experienced, the internal floods, the temptations of pride, the division, and the return, were all part of a planned journey. One night, as the stars dotted the sky, Shem slipped away in silence. He walked along the old trails, feeling the dew moisten his feet and hearing the distant echo of children's laughter mixed with the voices of those who had departed. There, in the twilight of dawn, events unfolded in his mind: his care for Noah, the lessons he had imparted, his fear of the flood, his disappointment with Cam, his anxiety over the departure of the young people. The memory of Arphaxad's return rekindled his spirit. His teachings had reached somewhere deep, even in the most restless hearts. Shem raised his eyes to the sky and felt the vastness of the generations that would come after him. A sudden clarity stirred his spirit. He was not only the guardian of Noah's stories, but a bridge between the world that had been destroyed and the one that was being born again. The pain, the separations, and even the failures had helped purify and elevate the faith of his household, creating deeper roots. On his knees, Shem realized that the purpose of the challenges had never been merely to protect them from evil, but to guide them to maturity and a more intimate understanding of God's presence. A sweet strength enveloped him, and he felt that everything was converging on this moment of wisdom. The past of losses and waiting, the nights of anguish and the mornings of hope, now revealed themselves as part of a great tapestry. His consciousness opened. The true legacy was not just to maintain customs, but to raise hearts sensitive to the Creator's direction, ready to choose faith every day. The climax of his life was before him. Tears streamed down his face as Shem understood the patient love with which God had guided every step, not to spare them from trials, but to make them worthy of the promises. With his face bathed in tears and gratitude, he decided never to look back with regret, but to rest his trust in the purpose of all they had lived, certain that through him, hope would reach countless generations. The morning after his night of revelation, Shem came down from the mountain with a different look, more serene and strong. The old weight on his face had given way to the light of one who had found the meaning of their journey. He walked slowly to the center of the camp, where adults and children were already preparing for the new day. The faces of his descendants seemed radiant with an unprecedented peace. Their voices were sweeter, and their gestures toward one another were full of respect and joy. Shem noticed that the strife and mistrust that had so often threatened them had given way to spontaneous cooperation. The younger ones, once restless and seduced by the ways of the outside world, now looked at the elders with gratitude, proud of their origins and eager to learn. That day, Shem gathered his entire lineage around the campfire. His voice, firm and generous, swept through the group like a warm breeze. He spoke of the arduous paths, confessing his doubts and fears, but also testifying to the miracle of the return of many and the peace achieved through faith. He told them that the secret of blessing was not in fleeing suffering, but in remaining faithful even when answers seemed distant. He recalled the dignity of Noah, the loyalty between brothers, the forgiveness necessary in the face of hurt, and the courage to start over. He humbly showed that his own weaknesses had forged the strength of those days. The atmosphere at that gathering was one of healing and celebration. Laughter mingled with tears, Hands were joined, and hearts that had once been closed opened up. Those who had left and returned shared their experiences, building bridges of understanding between generations. The elders, touched by the renewal, blessed the younger ones. Each one committed to keeping alive the heritage they had received, not just out of memory, but out of choice and sincere conviction. Shem felt that, finally, everyone understood the value of what they carried. As evening fell and the fire crackled softly, Shem looked around and saw the silent victory etched in every gaze. It was not a victory of great external achievements, but of a true transformation that had united his descendants around a greater purpose. He gave thanks in silence, certain that the promise was being fulfilled there, in the quiet healing of each wound, in the blossoming of new hope, and in the maturity of faith cultivated by time and love. Dusk arrived, bringing a golden glow to the camp, and everyone seemed to feel a silent expectation in their hearts. At that moment, Shem walked to the edge where the field met the valley, feeling the cool breeze and listening to the murmur of the other settlements in the distance. Suddenly, a strong wind began to blow softly and steadily, swirling leaves and lifting golden dust toward the sky. The people, attracted by the phenomenon, came out of their tents and approached Shem, standing around him with their eyes raised, perplexed by the scene. In the center of that circle of hopeful souls, Shem felt his heart burn as never before. His hands trembled with emotion as he fell to his knees, overcome by a force that did not come from himself. A reverent silence fell upon everyone. Then, without warning, an intense and welcoming light descended from the sky, enveloping Shem and everyone around him. It was as if the presence of God himself was there, touching each one of those present, washing away painful memories, fears, and old hurts. At that moment, the voices of the people rose in spontaneous songs, in perfect harmony that none of them had ever practiced before. Believers and doubters, old and young, all felt united, without difference of blood or thought. The miracle was not only in the light that shone, but in the tears that fell and the wounds of years being healed in the blink of an eye. Hearts opened in total acceptance, and an unshakable certainty of being loved by the Creator took root deep in each breast. Still prostrate, he finally raised his eyes and saw, in a spiritual way, the outlines of blessings extending to his descendants, like rivers of light crossing generations and reaching distant lands. He felt in his spirit the fulfillment of the promise made after the flood, that by choosing humility and faith in the face of all temptations and pride, God would make himself present, granting peace, prosperity, and eternal closeness. The light gradually dissolved, but the divine presence remained in the environment, discreet and palpable. The people, rising up around Shem, experienced a peace they had never felt before, an indestructible bond between themselves and the Creator. Smiles, hugs, and praises filled the valley as night fell, sealing the miracle that would forever transform Shem's entire lineage. At the break of the last night of the cycle, the camp glowed with a deep peace unlike anything that had ever been experienced before. The dawn was silent, like a divine whisper descending upon the tents and hearts. Shem, his hair now very white and his eyes alert, sat on the edge of a rock, looking at the fields and the people who had grown up under his guidance. There, in the first rays of light, he felt the full truth of the promise. What had been born of pain, torment, and loss had generated an unbreakable faith. Shem's people, once shaken by doubts, pride, and desire for what was new, now built together, shared food, welcomed the elderly, and embraced children and wanderers. The villages grew gently, without haste, like trees planted by calm waters. The stories of Noah, the ark, and the new beginning were told around the campfire, no longer as a warning, but as a sign of hope and direction. On that final day, Shem called everyone together for one last meeting. His gaze was firm and tender, his voice full of respect for what each person had become. He told them that the greatest blessings would come to those who accepted the most difficult path, that of obedience, reconciliation, and humility. He reminded them that even in future days of uncertainty, they could always choose to renew their faith and restore peace, without giving into pride or division. He said that by remaining together and sensitive to the will of the Creator, no storm could uproot them. The elders, the young, and the children listened and received his words as a sacred inheritance. Shem's lesson echoed like a seed sown in good soil. The greatest victories are not measured by visible achievements, but by the depth of love, faithfulness to promises, and openness to forgiveness. True strength was now the invisible bond that made them a family before God, ready to raise new generations marked by faith and integrity. At their farewell, under the sky already tinged with gold, they all embraced each other, aware that the history of that people would live on as long as they kept alive the flame of their covenant and mutual love. The name of Shem, blessed and faithful, would echo for millennia as a testimony that those who choose humility and faith will find protection, prosperity, and the embrace of the Creator Himself. If you were touched by this journey, leave a like, share what touched you most in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so that together we can celebrate more stories of faith and hope like this one.